It's time to play a game of Wheel of Privilege. So basically, there's this thing called the Wheel of Privilege. It's something that basically woke social justice warriors have created where it's this diagram image of different categories of how privileged people are. And it's a wheel that emanates outward, kind of like the wheel in Wheel of Fortune, where if you're closer to the center of the wheel, it's a more privileged category, and as you get further from the center of the wheel, it gets less privileged. And usually, there's three categories um, for there's 3 degrees of privilege for each category. So there'll be like 3 groups within one metric or one category. So for instance, if race is one, then there'd be white, then people who are in between, and then black. Or for like gender, it would be like cis man, cis woman, and then trans. Or for sexuality, it'd be like heterosexual, and then actually they differ a lot on that one. What are the 3 categories? But my point is that's, or like for instance, rich, middle class, poor would be the 3 categories for income. So it's like this is basically how they work, and I've found about 12 of these on Google image search. There's probably a lot more, to be honest, but I mean, I spent a lot of time analyzing these. So I made some pretty interesting findings, so I'm going to go over them, and I'm going to try to link to these in the description. All the images of the actual wheels of privilege. Now, here's the thing: the most obvious thing is, like, obviously they're going to say that white people are the most privileged and black people are the least privileged, or dark skinned people are the least privileged. And again, like, if you want to go through like the basic reasons why all this is bullshit, I mean, it's been done a lot of times. Like, I mean, I would say the number one reason with race is that white people are not privileged because we lack the privilege of having our own countries where we will still be the majority 2 or 3 generations from now. Regardless of wealth and other factors, I think that is a major thing against white privilege. Not only that, but the fact that there's institutionalized government discrimination in the form of affirmative action programs of various kinds. Not to mention the anti white teachings we're constantly subjected to by academia, the media, and the government, where they basically focus only on white historical and present day atrocities or repression, but then they ignore everything by non-whites. Except occasionally they'll focus on some genocides or oppression by non-whites, but only when it fits their agenda. Like, for instance, right now they focus a bit. There is some focus in the media on the Chinese oppression of the Uyghurs, the Uyghur Muslims, but it's like, again, that's only because it fits their agenda right now. And also, they do focus on the killings of Israelis by Palestinians, and that's because obviously Jews are so powerful within the media. But I digress. By and large, okay. And when it comes to gender, again, like the idea of male privilege, it's like even though men are the vast majority of, like, men die earlier on average, men are the majority of murder victims, suicides, workplace fatalities. Also, the fact that the family courts and the courts in general, just the entire legal system, discriminates against men in favor of women. I mean, there's a lot of examples as to why male privilege is bullshit. So yeah, I mean, putting all that aside, I rather than going through the obvious things, I'm going to go through the nitty gritty of some of the other categories and some of the more interesting things in these privilege wheels of privilege to show just how inconsistent these people are, and also how arbitrary and fallacious their reasoning often is. Now, some people might say, well, you can't expect them to be 100% consistent. These wheels were made by different people. It's like, that's true, but at the same time they do subscribe to the same ideology, and I think it is interesting how they can't make up their minds on some things, and also how just their internal logic is so flawed. So I'm going to go through them one at a time. Okay. So in the first wheel of privilege, a lot of it is the typical things you'd expect. But one thing I find very interesting is they list urbanites as more privileged and ruralites as less privileged. Interestingly, they don't mention suburbanites at all. Usually there's three categories, but they just skip the suburban category and they have urban as most privileged, rural as least. Now, I find that interesting because that would imply in most countries that right-wing voters are less privileged than left-wing voters, because in most countries urban areas do tend to vote more for liberal or left-wing parties. So I find that very interesting. Also, in most western countries, I believe rural people on average are whiter on average than in the big cities. In fact, I would say that's probably true in every western country. Like, I mean, in every white majority country, I would say yes, probably. The only places where there are white and non-white populations where white people might be a higher percentage in urban areas could be some Latin American countries, South Africa, and possibly some of the former Soviet Central Asian countries like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. But most white majority countries, I mean, I'd say any white majority country with I don't know, the possible exception of maybe Argentina. I don't exactly know how the urban rural divide works down in Argentina, but like, yeah, any Western white majority country, um, urbanites are less white on average. So I find that interesting how just the flagrant contradiction there, uh, both in terms of race and voting patterns. And I mean, also they're ignoring the fact there are a lot of wealthy ruralites out there. I mean, maybe yes, ruralites are poorer on average, but at the same time, I don't know. Like, I would personally put the most privileged category as suburbanites, but they don't even mention suburbanites there. But yeah. Anyway, the next thing that's interesting is in terms of sexuality, they actually have bisexuals, and this is one thing that I find recurring in a lot of these. Um, in fact, the majority of them, maybe almost all, they have bisexuals as less privileged than homosexuals. And I find that very interesting because I would think it would be the other way around, because it's like, hey, if you're from their logic, if they think of heterosexuals as the most privileged, it's like a bisexual is still closer to a heterosexual than a full-on homosexual is. A bisexual at least is attracted to the opposite sex. So it's like at least half their attraction would make them more privileged. You would think that in theory, but in practice, they're saying that no, bisexuals for whatever reason are less privileged than homosexuals. Now, there seems to be almost a consensus about this among these privilege wheels. Like, this one isn't even like one or two saying it. It's the vast majority of them are saying this. Now, if I had to hazard a guess as to why, I would think it's probably because they think that bisexuals get less representation in media and just maybe in society at large. Like, people are less aware of bisexuals. In fact, some people deny that bisexuals even exist. Like, they will say, no, you're either straight or gay. And if you're calling yourself bisexual, you're deluding yourself. And people tend to say that male bisexuals are actually gay, whereas female bisexuals are actually straight. It's like, that's generally the consensus among bisexual denialism, that it's like the female bisexuals are barsexuals doing it for attention, and the male bisexuals are gay men who are in denial about being full-on gay. So I guess, is that their argument? Like, bisexual erasure makes bisexuals less privileged than full-on homosexuals, I guess. But I think, from their own logic, you could also use the argument, yes, but a bisexual is still half straight. And therefore, in the same way, like a light-skinned black person would be more privileged than a dark-skinned black person, you would think a bisexual would be more privileged than a full-on gay person. But apparently not. So that's interesting. Another interesting thing that I found is the consensus in all these is that they have asexuals in the least privileged group, which I find very interesting. It's like, from their logic, they would have asexuals as less privileged than homosexuals. Like, I would think that gay people throughout history have been attacked or, persecuted for their sexual proclivities a lot more than people who just don't want to fuck anyone. I mean, people who voluntarily don't want to fuck anyone would be largely left alone, I think, which is kind of their wish. Like, I really think that through their own internal logic, putting asexuals as the least privileged category makes no sense. I mean, I guess they're disadvantaged by their own biology in the sense that they just don't enjoy sex, but that's not really what privilege means. It's supposed to be a social construct. I guess I don't know. They're kind of ambiguous about whether privilege is something that's innate or something that's purely a social construct. Because, say, for instance, they have mental and physical disability, so it's like those to some extent are just innate. Like, even in a society where disabled people are treated really well, they're still disadvantaged by the fact that they are disabled. So it's like, I don't know, is that what they're trying to say, that asexuals are least privileged because they're fucked over by their own biology and they can't enjoy sex? Or are they saying that asexuals are the least privileged because society persecutes them the most, which is something I would heavily disagree with. Like, I would say, like, regardless of whether or not said persecution is justified, which is a whole other topic, I would say gays are definitely historically and to some extent in certain places presently persecuted more than asexuals. So again, like that whole fucking thing makes absolutely no sense. Um so they have, okay, one term that keeps popping up is different shades for the race category. So between black and white, they have what they call different shades. And a lot of these wheels of privilege have this as a category. So what different shades I think means is basically people who are neither white nor black, people who fall somewhere in between, brown, Asian, what have you, even maybe light-skinned blacks. So yeah, I mean, I guess this is internally consistent more so, but some of these others later on are going to have racial categories that are much less consistent. Okay, now we get into one where they really start getting inconsistent, which is age privilege. Generally speaking, like this one says that people aged 25 to 55 are the most privileged, whereas anybody older or younger than that is less privileged. And I find in most of these, the consensus is the same, that like people who are either middle-aged or maybe a little bit younger than middle-aged, like people who are considered adults but not elderly or young adults, are considered the most privileged. I would say there's maybe some truth to that. Like maybe in the working world, it's a benefit to be that age, like 25 to 55 or 25 to 60 or what have you, not too young, not too old. But I would also argue there's some circumstances in which being middle-aged is worse. Like for instance, I find police and legal systems are often stricter on people of that age than anyone else. Like if you're younger, you get somewhat of a pass because you're young and because it's like, oh, you're young, you're immature, you don't know better. Whereas if you're really old, the police will never suspect you to begin with. And elderly people can get away with a lot of shit. Like they'd probably be the best people to use as drug mules because just nobody suspects them. Police, yeah, they definitely, I would say, go pretty easy on elderly people as a rule, and society in general does. Like people just don't suspect elderly people and aren't afraid of them. So I would say being middle-aged could be a privilege in some respects, like in the working world, but it could be a disadvantage in others. Like I'd say in dealing with the police or the law, like I would actually say middle-aged slash, like not just middle-aged, but even people younger than middle-aged, like 25 to 40 or whatever. Like I'd say if you're in the 25 to 60 group, you're probably, yeah, I'd say it's an advantage in the working world, but a disadvantage when dealing with law enforcement and the courts. So again, maybe I'm wrong. Like some people would say that teenagers are targeted more by police. I would say, yeah, maybe teenagers are viewed more suspiciously by police. But I would say when it comes to being charged, they might get a little bit of a pass based on being younger. Whereas, and there are things like the Young Offenders Act that literally protect them. Whereas, like, if you're middle aged, it's like or even like, 25 to 40 or whatever, the hammer can come down on you pretty hard. There's not that much sympathy or forgiveness. Same with also like with certain mental health issues. Like, there's a lot more sympathy for like young like people who are like under 25 dealing with like various mental health issues like ADHD, autism or whatever. Whereas like when you get a bit older, it's like, you know, you're expected to own your own shit and suck it up, buttercup, even more so, I would say. But then again, when you get elderly, like there becomes more sympathy again because it's like, well, you're old and frail. So again, like I think it really depends on the context with age, how it should be considered here. So anyway, the next one is body type. This one's interesting because it actually does acknowledge tall privilege, which a lot of these don't, but this one actually does say taller people are more privileged. It also says slim. Now, most of these have the same for weight, where it's like thin is the most privileged, average build in between, and then obese is the least privileged. This one also has short people as being the least privileged. Most of these privilege wheels do not include height, but this one does. Now, I think it's interesting because I would agree to an extent on this, but I would say there's a notable exception, which is that if you are extremely tall, like freakishly tall, that may not necessarily be a benefit. Like if you're like 7 feet tall or something like that. But for the most part, yes, being taller, like it's proven that like CEOs and high ranking people, high earning people are overwhelmingly taller than average, both among men and women. That's another thing that complicates it is that being tall if you're a woman is good for the working world. It's actually can be bad in terms of men viewing you as attractive. Like it's one thing that doesn't make sense when people talk about eugenics. It's like, why are men evolved to be attracted to short women? That's actually dysgenic when you think about it, because it's like, hey, if you have a son with that short woman, he's going to get half her genes, you know? He could be short himself. So again, I digress. But my point is, yeah, okay, it's a bit complicated. I would also personally say that yes, being thinner is viewed as more of a positive than being fatter. If you're a woman, if you're a man, it's more complicated. I would say if you're a man, being overly thin can actually be a bad thing because you're viewed as weak. I would say the most privileged physique for men would be like muscular. I'm not like necessarily like crazy muscular, like a bodybuilder, but like fairly muscular, well built. Like I would say that would be more privileged than being scrawny for sure if you're a man. So again, like this, it seems like the body type privilege is very much like female centric. They're not really thinking it in terms of men as much, except with the height. But most of these privilege wheels don't even take height into account. So this is one of the few that does. So I guess props to them for thinking of that. Now, this is interesting. This category is actually the incels rise up category because they actually have singles as being less privileged than people who are in relationships. So that it's funny, like sometimes there's actually some overlap between incel ideology and woke SJW ideology, even though they're enemies. Like on some issues like this, they can occasionally agree. And this is one where they do agree, at least in this case, that single people are less privileged than people in relationships. Now, when they're thinking of single, they might be thinking like, oh, polyamorous women as opposed to like incel men. But it's like, it is funny how it's like, by accident they're agreeing with incels in this case, even if they don't mean to. They have categories settlers and indigenous. They always have settlers as more privileged than indigenous, and settlers means basically white people if you're in North America or whatever. What I find interesting is how being a settler makes you more privileged, but being an immigrant makes you less privileged. So it really raises the question, where do you draw the line between an immigrant and a settler? Like, you know, my ancestors came to Canada from Austria in the early 20th century. Does that make them settlers or immigrants? I mean, is it literally just, oh, if you're white, you're a settler? Even if, like, your ancestors came here from Serbia in the 1990s, you're still a settler. But then if your ancestors came from Hong Kong in the 1960s, you're an immigrant. It makes no fucking sense. But anyway, they also have English speakers as more privileged than non-English speakers. I would actually agree with that one. So anyway, that's the first one. Now let's get on to the second one. again, this one has cis women as more privileged than transgenders. That's generally for gender. They have cis men, then cis women, and then trans slash non-binary slash intersex whatever. Um, and they do have lighter shades in between white and dark for race, so it's consistent with the first one again. Interestingly, for sexuality, this one has gay men as being more privileged than lesbians, as well as more privileged than It has lesbians, bisexuals, and asexuals as the least privileged category, whereas gay men are in the in between category with heterosexuals as most privileged. I find that interesting because actually, if you look historically and today, gay men have been persecuted more than lesbians. Like, there's a lot of countries, even today in Africa and other parts of the third world, where lesbianism is legal, but male homosexuality is illegal. Now, obviously, there's reasons for this because, like with the whole STI, STD crisis and the issues to do with children being molested, like these things do tend to be issues that are more prevalent within the gay male community rather than the lesbian community. So it's like, yeah, there's reasons for this bias, but at the same time, I think it's according to their own internal logic, it's kind of bullshit to put lesbians as less privileged than gay men. I think it's honestly because like it's one of the cases where the wires kind of cross in their brains because they automatically think of women as less privileged than men, but then they ignore the fact that actually gay men have been historically and today more persecuted than lesbians on average. Like, so it's one of those cases where I think their own internal contradictions become very apparent. But in all these cases, like I haven't seen one that has gay men as less privileged than lesbians. It's usually the other way around, but sometimes they lump them in the same category. Okay, so again, this one has thin privilege as before. So yeah, going on to number 3. Um, Again, it has single slash divorced slash widowed people as less privileged than people in relationships. So it's like, yeah, incels rise up, and it's like, oh, are you actually giving a shout out to divorced men here as an unprivileged group? Because I would actually agree with that. Divorced men are a legitimately oppressed group. They are in a very bad category, and yeah, incels also. Again, I don't know if that's what they're thinking of, but it's like one of those unintentional horseshoe theory things where it's like they're agreeing with the incels and the MRAs, but for different reasons, I guess. Now this one is interesting. It has urbanites as most privileged, suburbanites in between, and ruralites as the least privileged. I don't know how you could argue that urbanites are more privileged than suburbanites. Suburbanites are the most privileged group by far in terms of where they live because they get away with everything. Like they are the ultimate NIMBYs. They always manage to reject every undesirable land use, like homeless shelters, low income housing, whatever, and all this shit just gets dumped onto the cities. And in some cases, it's in the small towns too, but the suburbs basically manage to avoid it totally. And I would wager the suburbs are also probably wealthier on average than either the cities or the rural areas. I mean, that would vary from country to country. But I would say in a North American context or Australia and New Zealand, that is probably true that the suburbs are the wealthiest overall. So, yeah, I mean, and also one thing, okay, one area where sometimes it's biased by the fact that, like, the technical city includes areas that are actually suburbs. Like, say, for instance, in Toronto, I would argue large portions of the city of Toronto, the 416, the amalgamated 6 boroughs, are more suburban than urban. So, I mean, the statistics on city limits don't always account for that. But yeah, I think that's flagrant bullshit. And it's also just inconsistent with their own beliefs. Like, a lot of leftists do tend to be anti-suburban, which is, well, I guess one of the areas I kind of agree with them on, maybe for different reasons, but um yeah, in this case they're flagrantly contradicting that. So interestingly for race they have white, then white passing, then what they call BIPOC, then dark. I thought BIPOC, BIPOC were dark skinned, but I don't know. It's a bit confusing. So I guess there's kind of an intermediate category, but two intermediate categories, but it's a bit confusing what they mean. So let's see. This one does have lesbians and gays and bisexuals as equal as the least privileged. It has cis man as most, and then cis woman, and then lesbian, gay, bi. So this is interesting. It combines the gender and sexuality into one category, even though usually there are two categories. For age, this one is middle-aged as most privileged, then young adult, and then retired, and then older adults and children and youth as the least privileged. So again, this one, it has middle-aged as most. There seems to be, wherever age comes up, the consensus middle-aged and maybe a bit younger, like 25 to 60 or whatever, are the most privileged. I don't know if I entirely agree with that, but again, like, it's interesting though that they have the seniors as less privileged, even though seniors are the most right-wing voting demographic. So yeah. And even though a lot of leftists and liberals keep saying "okay, boomer" constantly, so I find that interesting. And even a lot of them have said they look forward to the day these old people die out, so that society will become less conservative. So I find that interesting how they say that, but then they also have the elderly and seniors as being the least privileged group in terms of age, along with children, I guess. And they have this idea that like children are somehow oppressed because they're not given full freedom. I don't know. It doesn't make any sense, because it's like, these are the same people who advocate for like much stricter laws in terms of age of consent. Like they don't even want like, it to be legal for like a 30-year-old to have sex with like an 18-year-old. But then at the same time, they also say that children are an oppressed group because they're not given enough freedom. So it's like, it's very complicated. This is very confusing. So they have Christian as most privileged, and then non-Christian, other non-Christians, and then Muslims as least privileged. I find that interesting. So they are saying that Jews are more privileged than Muslims. That's interesting. And then they have slender, then average, then fat. So I think, yeah, this third one here is from the UK, I think. So I guess that could be taken into account to some extent, but yeah. So anyway, sorry, the next one is the fourth one. And this one, interestingly, has job seniority as a category, which I would agree with. That is an aspect of privilege, unironically. This one has heterosexuals as more privileged than lesbians, gays, and bisexuals, who are all in the less privileged category together. This one also has whites over people of color. It doesn't differentiate between different degrees of people of color. And this one has, this one's a bit more binary in its outlook. It doesn't tend to have gradients as much. And then middle-aged as most privileged, then youth, and then as the least is elderly. So yeah, it seems to be like, generally speaking, middle-aged people are seen as the most privileged. And I guess by middle-aged, they're probably including people in their 30s, maybe even late 20s, according to this definition. Because it seems like the broad definition of middle-aged. So yeah, the fifth one, property owners more privileged than renters. This is one I often see popping up. White more privileged than different shades, who are more privileged than dark. So yeah, different shades, that term popping up again. I guess it means like, yeah, Asians, browns, maybe even light-skinned blacks. Cis man, then cis woman, then trans man, then trans woman / non-binary. This is the first and the only one that I see differentiating between different types of transgendered people. This has trans man as more privileged than trans woman, which is interesting. They think that trans men have male privilege a little bit, but not too much, I guess. This is the only one I've seen making this differentiation. And this one has heterosexuals, then gay men, and then lesbian, bi / asexuals. So this one, again, has gay men as more privileged than lesbians. So as I've said, like, either gay men are considered more privileged than lesbians or at the same level. I've never seen one that has lesbians as more privileged than gay men. So